Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast of St. Louis on the Air, brought to you by University College at Washington University. With undergraduate and graduate programs, part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. Jefferson Barracks is associated with a lot of American military history. It has been a South County fixture for almost 200 years and is known as a former major military installation for its National Military Cemetery, its VA hospital, and museums, of course. But this Veterans Day is a good time to learn more about this historic site. Joining me in studio is Mark Trout, President and CEO of the Missouri Civil War Museum. Mark, thanks for coming in.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, 1826 is when it all started. Why? What was happening at that time to generate this installation?
At least for Jefferson Barracks, it all started then. Yeah, they had outgrown Fort Bell Fountain up in the northern part of the county here, and they were looking for a new, more modern place to create this new military fort or base. And they discovered that plateau down there in South St. Louis made the ideal place. It was elevated. It was on a plateau. It overlooked the river, which was strategic in their eyes. And it just made sense for them to have it. They had a spring there, and everything that they really needed for like an infrastructure was there. The railroad lines are there and so forth. So it made an ideal spot for them.
Why was it necessary at all? What was going on at that time?
Oh, I just think it was more of an expansion of the military itself. They were cramped up in Fort Bell Fountain, and then the obstacles, the natural stuff, it just made sense for them to come down more onto that plateau, more room and elevation and so forth.
Well, let's talk about some of the things historically that were happening in the subsequent years that Jefferson Barracks played a part in. And I guess fighting with the Indians was right there at the top of the list early on.
Yeah, the Black Hawk Wars with Chief Black Hawk. Troops from Jefferson Barracks got involved in that in the 1830s. In fact, they brought Chief Black Hawk to Jefferson Barracks. That's where he was held prisoner of war. There's been two times in Jefferson Barracks' history where we had prisoners of war. One, obviously, with Chief Black Hawk, and then the second being the Second World War, when some of the German and Italian prisoners of war were brought to Jefferson Barracks and were housed there. Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, things marched on. We were very, very good at going to war during that particular period of history.
Yeah, Jefferson Barracks, the best way to sum Jefferson Barracks up, it's always been a troop mobilization point, be it from the Civil War, and so forth. Even during the Mexican War, troops were mobilized there. Going through the Indian Wars, it plays a significant point. I always argue that St. Louis is known as the gateway to the West, but I think Jefferson Barracks is that gate. That's where the patrols and the wagons would have went off from, and so forth as they went out. The pioneers did onto the West. But even in the Indian Wars that followed the Civil War, and then especially the Spanish-American War, a lot of people don't realize that every Missouri soldier in the Spanish-American War came through Jefferson Barracks.
Oh, really?
Every single one of them. And that's one of the places why we have the largest burial ground of not only Civil War dead, but also Spanish-American War. Matter of fact, the first death of the Spanish-American War, that soldier is laid at rest at Jefferson Barracks.
Why would all of the soldiers in that particular war have gone through Jefferson Barracks?
It was just an ideal modern mobilization point. Once again, going back to with the railroad lines there, right on the edge of the metropolitan area of St. Louis, and then that river as well, and it's just every single one of them. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the Civil War. What was its role at that time? I mean, given where Missouri was in that conflict.
Right. Primarily another mobilization point. Many regiments of cavalry and infantry were established at Jefferson Barracks. You see really three locations where these troops from the Civil War are coming into. Obviously in the Arsenal area down there in the city of St. Louis, and then up at Benton Barracks, which is we know as Fairgrounds Park now, up there off of I-70 West Florissant, and then Jefferson Barracks, of course. But dozens and dozens of infantry and cavalry units were established at Jefferson Barracks. Some of the most prestigious ones, like the 1st and the 10th Cavalry, all come out of Jefferson Barracks.
I was surprised to hear that both Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, and Robert E. Lee, whom we all know, all had a presence at one time at Jefferson Barracks.
Oh, absolutely. I kind of tell, we had over 220 Civil War generals that served at Jefferson Barracks before, during, or after the Civil War. That includes Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Pickett, Custer, Longstreet. The list goes on. I always tell my students and my guests, I said, it's easier for me to tell you. Stonewall Jackson was not here, but everybody else was.
Easier to put it that way.
It makes it easy.
And what were their positions? So let's just stick with Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. What was Davis doing, for instance?
Yeah, Jefferson Barracks was a premier post for some of these graduates, especially these West Pointers that were coming out. They loved St. Louis and it made an ideal thing. Robert Lee was here twice, as a young engineer, and then in the 1850s, he becomes the executive officer behind Albert Sidney Johnson of the new famed 2nd U.S. Cavalry, which was established by Jefferson Davis, who was the Secretary of War at the time. They were called Davis's pets. It was going to be the premier cavalry unit ever created. And so when you look at that roster of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry with Albert Sidney Johnson, who will lose his life at the Battle of Shiloh, second in command Robert E. Lee, you had Kirby Smith, George Thomas, Jeb Stuart. It's a who's who of the Civil War in this one cavalry unit. So it's pretty spectacular.
Wasn't the first cavalry unit established at Jefferson Barracks? The Dragoons that they were called?
The Dragoons were there.
Yeah.
I don't know if the first one, that's I don't know about that one, but that was a little bit before the Civil War, which is my
sure.
area of interest. But that's how it's always been with Jefferson Barracks. It's always been kind of a premier post. Even at the turn of the 20th century, in 1900, we have numerous newspaper articles from St. Louis newspapers showing how Jefferson Barracks is being improved and going to become the premier cavalry post of the U.S. Army. There was all kinds of talks about that. So it's had a illustrious, amazing 10 as far as a military post.
You mentioned that the Civil War is your specialty there, obviously, with the Civil War Museum. What do you talk to folks about? I mean, obviously we talked a little bit about personalities who were involved in that conflict. What else do you talk about in connecting it to the barracks?
Well, in the barracks is really just bringing to life the characters who were there, the people who were there, through time. So it's hard just to talk about the 4 years of the Civil War about Jefferson Barracks, without kind of growing to pre-Civil War and post, because it has such a wonderful and important part in American military history. And then you lump in the issues with the National Cemetery that is there, which is, again, a who's who. It's one of the most active national cemeteries today. We have, a lot of people don't realize, we have somewhere on the average of 28 to 30 funerals a day at our national cemetery.
I had no idea.
There's well over 250,000 soldiers that are buried there from the Revolution. We have Revolutionary War soldiers all the way to the ones that were laid at rest today. It's a magnificent place. I think there's, if my memory serves me right, we have like 9 Medal of Honor recipients who are at rest at Jefferson Barracks. Interesting thing about the barracks as well is it's the largest, it's ranked number 1 in the system as far as the largest concentration of group burials. We have like over 550 group burials, which are more than one soldier in a grave, going all the way back to Colonel Gentry and the Battle of Okeechobee, all the way up to Vietnam, where some of the soldiers are buried together.
Was there this is kind of in the recesses of my memory, and I may be wrong, but wasn't there some connection between the Tomb of the Unknowns in Washington and Jefferson Barracks Cemetery?
Right, Michael Blassie.
Okay,
Michael Blassie of St. Louis.
Tell us that story, if you would.
Yeah, I'll never forget that one, because actually my oldest son was born on the day that he was brought back here. So
really?
I still have that newspaper article, a hero comes home. But yes, Michael Blassie was lost in Vietnam and was missing in action. And I believe the family always thought that there was a possibility that he could be the soldier in the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Washington, D.C. And through the science of DNA and so forth, they were able to prove that some 19 years ago, somewhere right around there, and positively identify him. So Michael Blassie was removed from the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier of Vietnam there in Washington, D.C., and brought back home here. And he's at rest at the National Cemetery here at Jefferson Barracks.
What was that ceremony like?
I didn't attend that ceremony on that. That was the day my oldest son was born. I was in the hospital.
Other things.
I was in the hospital, but I sure would like to be there. But I am in the National Cemetery every week with be it some tours or students and so forth. And he is always a stop that we make to honor him.
When did the cemetery come into being?
Well, the Jefferson Barracks Post was created in 1826, and it's called Jefferson Barracks, not because of Jefferson Davis, but because of Thomas Jefferson, who had died earlier that year. The first person to be laid at rest and established our cemetery was a young girl named Eliza Ann Lash. She was the infant daughter of one of the officers there. She had passed away in 1827, and she's the one that established our cemetery. So Jefferson Barracks is interesting if you get into it. It's actually a cemetery within a cemetery. You have what we call the Old Post Cemetery. So this is pre-Civil War. Remember, the national cemeteries they're not established until the Civil War. So this is well before Arlington and other cemeteries like that. But we have the Old Post Cemetery, and if any visitors that come there, when you drive into the National Cemetery, all the tombstones, all the headstones are all the same. They all look the same.
Sure.
But the farther you drive towards the Mississippi River, you'll start encountering tombstones and headstones that are different sizes and different shapes. Once you see that, you're pretty much in the Old Post Cemetery, because that standardized headstone that we're so used to seeing at national cemeteries today doesn't come into being until the 1870s. So if you're looking for the Civil War or the Indian Wars or pre-Civil War burials at Jefferson Barracks, go find the odd-shaped and different-shaped monuments and memorials, and then you're in the Civil War section in the pre.
How many graves are there of Civil War?
Civil War, well, we're the largest burial ground of Civil War dead in all of Missouri. There's at last count, there's about a little over 12,000 federal soldiers, 1,100 Confederate soldiers, and about 3,300 unknowns. And there's a couple of reasons, a couple of historical things that make that possible. Number one, Jefferson Barracks is a major hospital complex during the Civil War. They'd bring them up on the river on the boats, and also the railroad line is there, and they'd bring them on the railroad lines. And so just like any large hospital complex in the Civil War, where you had a lot of soldiers that are wounded, you had a lot of death. And so they started interning them into that Old Post Cemetery with Eliza Ann Lash, and that's what started it there. So that's the one reason there's so many. The other reason is shortly after the Civil War, by 1869, soldiers, the War Department had ordered soldiers to go out and scour the countryside and look for their comrades who had fallen in combat. And since Missouri was so scattered, and you had soldiers buried in little hamlets and small cemeteries, churchyards, and in the woods, unlike the East, where the dead was pretty much concentrated on the big battlefields, they recovered 10,000 of them and brought those soldiers back to a place of honor. And so that's what you have.
How many graves are there?
Overall, I know there's over 250,000. I think it's closing in on 280,000 now.
I had no idea it was that extensive.
Matter of fact, that's why I think the St. Louis County government and the federal government are under negotiations finalizing their deal of taking over part of Sylvan Springs Park to make room for additional burials. I think the federal government must have been a little short-sighted coming out of World War II when they started selling off Jefferson Barracks. They landlocked the National Cemetery, and I guess they didn't think, what's going to happen 50, 60, 70 years from now?
Figured it was all over that.
Yeah, and next thing you know, so that's going to push us out a little bit more to allow more space for burials.
Right. We have a caller here who wants to talk about that part of the park. Jack in Warsaw, Missouri. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Thanks for having me on the air, and I appreciate your topic today, and I enjoyed the guest comments on it. I was just going to have him comment on something I know about that not a lot of people know, that in the Jefferson Barracks Cemetery, there is certain tombstones that aren't round at the top. They go to sort of a point, and that's a section in there where back in the days of the Civil War and then when it was first getting going, they had locked up people that were Southern sympathizers and housed them in the Arsenal Street. There was a place on Arsenal Street called, the Arsenal. It's the Arsenal, probably. And they still have pieces of the gate and all of the metal works from that around in the surrounding Jefferson Barracks area in these various little parks around there where they have some of the veterans events. And in the cemetery, though, you can tell that these were, they'll say, unknown child or something like that, or unknown person. And these are going to a point like that. That's in the people that were considered to be of the Confederacy, but they were also, they were citizens of the United States of America in the long run. And we're all, they're buried there in this cemetery, and they're given respect like all the other many thousands of people buried there.
Jack, thank you for the call. Appreciate it. Children's graves and these special pointed headstones.
Right. There's quite a few civilian graves that are in the National Cemetery from that period in time. It was the mid 1870s is when the federal government finally started standardizing those stones. It was also where they passed their views on that the Confederate soldiers would be honored just like the Federal soldiers. So the Confederates would also get their grave markers. The pointed ones are the Confederate ones. In Jefferson Barracks, all of our Confederate soldiers are buried together, all 1,100 of them. There are some unknowns amongst them, but they do have a point on them. So that when you see the typical and popular modern military marker of our soldiers, they have a curved round top. The Confederates are a point.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to all the concerns we've been hearing the last year or two about anything Confederate. Statues have been pulled down, as we well know. You getting any flack at all over there with regard to the Confederates buried there?
No, that's probably a topic for another interview there, because that's going to take some time. We're obviously faced with that every day. St. Louis has obviously had their mix of it, in regards to it now, with the memorial and monument in Tower Grove Park with Christopher Columbus. So
and Forest Park with
right,
with the other.
Yeah, with the Confederate monument, like I tell most folks, when it comes to the Civil War, we're a Civil War museum, and our job is preservation. Mm-hmm. What we end up doing in the future with these memorials and so forth, I guess this nation's going to have to come to grip with what it really wants to do. So. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but our point right now, anything that we recover, be it a musket or be it a saber or be it a memorial, our job is preservation to save them and see what happens in the end. So we're preservationists first and foremost.
Give me kind of a tour of that museum. We've got a couple of minutes left. What exactly are people going to find there, aside from the muskets and the bayonets and what have you?
Well, I would think that we have the largest display of Civil War artifacts on display than any other place in the state. We definitely have more in reserve. Actually, I could tell your guests, for anybody who's been out to the Missouri Civil War Museum in Jefferson Barracks in the last 5 years, come the first of the year is when all of our exhibits are starting to change. So come springtime, if anybody who's even been out there before comes out, they will see hundreds and hundreds of new objects. We're a museum that we don't have the large budgets as some of the other ones and so forth, and we don't get into a lot of electronics interpretation and things like that. But we're heavy on items. So I've always prided ourselves. If you want to learn a lot about the war and so forth, you can get on the internet and so forth. But if you want to see objects, you want to see uniforms, you want to see their weapons, you want to see their items from the war and so forth, we have that there. We also have a nice gallery to the history of Jefferson Barracks. So we have not just Civil War in our museum, but we also have one permanent gallery dedicated to the history of Jefferson Barracks. So guests will find uniforms really from 1826 all the way up until today in Afghanistan and Iraq, of soldiers that have been there and come from Jefferson Barracks. So we have a lot. A lot of our stuff is related to Jefferson Barracks. A lot of our stuff, of course, is related to Missouri.
I think most people don't know that there were more Civil War battles fought in the state of Missouri than any place else.
We're ranked three. Ranked number three. Virginia and Tennessee are the only ones that have more than us. We've had over 1,100 engagements in Missouri. So we have actually an electronic map at the museum where somebody can stand in front and watch it, and then every second a new bullet goes onto that map of Missouri, and you can just see it by year of how it's increasing and so forth. The interesting thing about Missouri is in 1864, when kind of the battles are starting to wind down in the Civil War, Missouri is actually escalating. Really? That's got a lot to do with the guerrilla activity on the west and the north and so forth.
What's the most, 45 seconds left, the most significant Civil War battle in Missouri?
Well, there's several. Wilson's Creek obviously is a big St. Louis-related one because of the St. Louis connection, with General Lyon from the St. Louis Arsenal and many of his German troops and St. Louis troops that go off. Franz Siegel is there. He's got a beautiful sculpture in Forest Park.
Yeah.
He's with him and so forth. So that would be the big one at Wilson's Creek. But you also have Westport. You have Pilot Knob, and there's all kinds of them. 1,100 of them. Even some of the smaller ones like Centralia are noted in history, where Bloody Bill Anderson annihilated the 139th Missouri Infantry, which is the largest casualty as far as percentage of a loss for a Union regiment in the war, will happen here in Missouri.
Well, that's quite a piece of real estate you're working on over there at
It sure
Jefferson
is.
Barracks, and
It sure is.
I know you're doing a great job at the Civil War Museum. Mark Trout, thank you so much for being with us, and this is a great day, Veterans Day, to talk about what you're doing down there.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good to have you. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.